Saint Bernard the Wonder Worker, excerpts from the life and times of Saint Bernard by Abbot Theodore Ratisbonne, and Heroic Virtue, a portion of the treatise of Benedict XIV on the beatification and canonization of the servants of God, Volume 3. Saint Bernard is known and loved throughout the world for many things: his holiness of life, his writings, Marian devotion, his confrontation with Peter Abelard, and his numerous erections of monasteries. What is often unknown about Saint Bernard were the numerous miracles that he worked during his life. Miracles were so common that the various chroniclers that would follow him around when he left the monastery were unable to keep track of them all. It is our hope that this audiobook will increase your devotion to Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and that you are able to look upon Saint Bernard not just as a great doctor of the Church, but as a wonder worker and a powerful heavenly friend. Chapter 1. Early Miracles of Saint Bernard. The frankness of Saint Bernard, the holy boldness with which he raised his voice in behalf of justice, were at the same time accompanied by such profound meekness and perfect disinterestedness that his words had the authority of an oracle. The young abbot had retained from his early education a noble refinement of tone and manner, and a delicacy of language which, added to his mental endowments, spontaneously won all hearts. Every look, every movement shed the glory of grace, benevolence, heavenly life around his person, and every word of his bore its fruit. He had always, says an ancient author, consolation for the afflicted, help for the oppressed, counsel for the troubled in mind, a resource for every necessity, a balm for every sickness." End quote. So many virtues and eminent qualities, all consecrated to the service of the Church, could not remain hidden. They shone more and more brightly every day, and, at the period of which we are now writing, the name of Saint Bernard is seen to beam as a star on the horizon of his country. His correspondence attests to the relations subsisting between him and the principal personages of his time, not only in France, but in Italy, Germany, Portugal, and even Asia. The monastery of Clairvaux had become a sacred spot to which curiosity, no less than piety, attracted a crowd of illustrious strangers. They came to contemplate the ancient marvel of the desert in the heart of France. Besides this edifying spectacle, many miracles were spoken of as having been wrought by the saint. It was well known that a child from the neighborhood of Clairvaux had been presented to Bernard in a state of extreme suffering. His arm was paralyzed, his hand withered. Bernard prayed, made the sign of the cross upon the child, and restored him to his mother perfectly cured. A no less extraordinary cure was wrought on a rich man named Humbert, who afterwards became a religious, and was the first abbot of the monastery of Igny. This man, to whom Bernard bore a particular affection, was so terribly afflicted with epilepsy as to fall into fits 7 times a day. Bernard prayed for him whom he loved so much. From that moment, Humbert was cured, and never again to the end of his life experienced a single attack of the sickness. It is also related that, being in the diocese of Leon, on the day of the dedication of the new church of the monastery which he had founded there, this church was filled with so incredible a multitude of flies that their buzzing disturbed the devotions of the faithful. And as there was no other way of getting rid of them, the saint cried, "Excommunicave eas." The next day they were all found dead, and their number was so great that they blackened the pavement and were carried out of the church with shovels. To which a chronicler adds that this miracle was so well known and so celebrated that the curse of the flies of Fogny passed into a proverb among the people around, who had come from all parts to assist at the dedication of that church. One day, several knights, on their way to a tournament, passed by Clairvaux, and asked the night's lodging in the monastery. It was towards the end of Lent, and Bernard, while he lavished the duties of hospitality upon his guests, did not conceal from them the extreme pain he felt to see young Christians full of such frivolities at the solemn season of the year when the church is in mourning and retirement and penance. "I ask a truce of you," said he, "till after Holy Lent." But the knights, impatient to distinguish themselves at the tournament, could not resolve to accede to his desire. "In that case," said Saint Bernard, "I shall ask this grace of God, and I have a firm confidence that I shall obtain it." He then ordered wine to be served to them, blessed the cup, and said, "Drink to the health of your souls." They drank, and soon afterwards took leave of the holy abbot. But they had scarcely set forth when their consciences began to trouble them, and they communicated to each other the emotions they experienced, and the strange anxiety of their minds. What they had seen and heard at Clairvaux absorbed them entirely, and tears of regret and tenderness moistened their eyes when they compared the vanity of their lives with the grave and holy lives of these servants of God. All, with one accord, turned back again, and influenced by a holy desire after perfection, they stripped off their armor, laid aside their rich garments, and prostrated themselves at Bernard's feet to consecrate themselves to God. They vowed the rest of their lives to the tranquil exercise of the spiritual warfare of the children of Jesus Christ. Some among them, adds the biographer, are still fighting in the service of God. Many more already reign with Christ in heaven, having been delivered in this world from the bonds of their mortal bodies. Chapter 2. The Labors of Saint Bernard in Milan. The ancient church of Milan deserved the reproaches addressed to one of the 7 churches in the Apocalypse. She was dead, for she had broken the sacred bond which united her to the Mother Church, the center of living unity, by the suggestions of her proud archbishop, had rendered her indocile, and, not content with the illustrious rank she had always held in the Catholic world, she aimed at independence and coveted the primacy, sacrificing the holiest laws of the Christian world to satisfy her ambition. Her first error had been in refusing to acknowledge the lawful pope, and, by this fatal schism, which degraded her in proportion as it inflated her pride, she became engaged in the interests of human policy, subject to all its complications. The schismatic Archbishop Anselm had taken no notice of the excommunication which 2 popes had pronounced against him. The schismatics were successfully disappointed when they heard of the triumph of the German troops, the coronation of Lotharius, the submission of Conrad, and, above all, of the peace which Saint Bernard had established in the neighboring cities. They turned against Archbishop Anselm, and reproached him as the cause of the evils which threatened them. The unfaithful archbishop sought to escape from the resentment of his clergy by resigning his jurisdiction into the hands of the metropolitan bishop, and the metropolitan took advantage of this state of the people's mind to prepare the way for Saint Bernard. At this favorable moment the holy monk arrived in Lombardy, accompanied by 2 cardinals and the venerable Bishop of Chartres. They had hardly descended, write the authors of that time, when all of Milan went forth to meet the man of God, nobles and citizens, the former on horseback, the latter on foot, and the rich and the poor left their houses as if they had deserted the town. They went out in crowds with inconceivable reverence to meet the servant of Christ, and transported with joy on beholding him, they esteemed themselves happy in hearing the sound of his voice. They kissed his feet, and, although he did his utmost to prevent it, he could not hinder them from throwing themselves at his feet, and prostrating themselves before him. They tore the threads out of his garments to serve as remedies for their diseases, in the persuasion that whatever had touched him was holy, and would contribute to their sanctification. The multitudes who preceded and followed him filled the airs with cries of joy and continued acclamations until he entered the city, where he was detained for a long time by the immense crowd before he could reach the honorable lodging which had been prepared for him. But when they came time to discuss in public the affair which had brought the servant of God and the cardinals to Milan, the whole city, forgetting its animosities and former pretensions, submitted completely to the holy abbot. Peace was soon restored, the parties of the church reconciled, and concord re-established among the dissenting parties by a solemn treaty. But when these matters were arranged, there arose others of a different kind. The devil exercised his fury in some possessed persons. The standard of Jesus Christ was opposed to him, and at the command of the man of God, the evil spirits, affrighted and trembling, fled from the abodes they had made for themselves, being driven out by a superior power. This was a new employment for this holy legate, who had received no orders from the Roman court on this subject, but, according to the divine law and the rule of faith, he produced, as a proof of his mission, letters written with the blood of Christ and sealed with the seal of the cross, before whom form and character all the powers of earth and hell must bow. We have never heard in the present day of a faith like that of this great people, or a virtue to be compared to that of this great saint. A humble and religious strife arose between them. The saint attributed the glory of these miracles to the lively faith of the people, and the people referred all the glory to the eminent sanctity of the servant of God. All, however, were firmly persuaded that he obtained whatever he asked from God. With this assurance they brought to him, amongst others, a woman well known to all, who had been tormented by an impure spirit for 7 years. They entreated him to deliver the unfortunate woman, and to command the devil to leave her body. The holy man began to pray. He received power from heaven, and commanded the evil one in the name of Christ. The woman was immediately cured, and restored to peace and tranquility. Another time, a very aged lady of high rank was brought to him, in the church of St. Ambrose, in the presence of a great number of persons. The devil, which had long possessed her, had suffocated her to such an extent that she had lost sight, hearing, and speech, and gnashing her teeth and stretching out her tongue like an elephant's trunk, she resembled a monster rather than a woman. Her hideous and fearful countenance and her horrible breath bore witness to the impurity of the spirit which possessed her body. When the servant of God beheld her, he knew that the devil was closely bound to, and, as it were, incarnate in her, and that it would not be easy to dislodge him from an abode where he had so long been master. Therefore, turning towards the people, who had flocked in crowds to the church, he recommended them to pray fervently to God, and, surrounded by the priests and religious who were near him, at the foot of the altar, he ordered that the woman should be brought before him and firmly held. The miserable creature resisted, and, animated by a diabolical and superhuman power, she struggled in horrible convulsions amidst those who held her, striking them and kicking the servant of God himself, who remained calm and unmoved, without being disturbed by the audacity of the demon. He humbly ascended the altar and began the celebration of the holy sacrifice. But every time that he made the sign of the cross on the sacred host, he turned towards the woman, and applied the virtue of the same sign to her. The devil, at these times, testified that he felt the power of this mighty sign by redoubling his fury and manifesting fresh rage and anguish. After the Pater Noster, the saint descended the steps of the altar, to come to close combat with the enemy of God. He held in his venerable hands the chalice, and the paten on which was the sacred host. Then, elevating them over the woman's head, he spoke as follows: "Evil spirit, behold thy judge, behold the Almighty. Resist now if thou canst, if thou darest to resist him, who, when about to die for our salvation, spoke these words: The time has come when the prince of this world shall be cast out. Behold the sacred body which was formed in the womb of a virgin, which hung upon the wood of the cross, was laid in the sepulchre, rose from the dead, and ascended into heaven in the sight of his disciples. By the dread power of this adorable majesty, I command thee, infernal spirit, to go out of the body of this servant of God, and never to re-enter it." The devil, being forced in spite of himself to obey and let go his hold, displayed all the violence of his fury during the few moments that remained to him, and tormented his victim with redoubled atrocity. The holy abbot, returning to the altar, proceeded to the fraction of the saving host, and gave the pax to the deacon, that he might transmit it to the people, and at the same moment the woman was restored to peace and health. Thus did Satan bear witness, not by his free testimony, but by his forced flight, to the virtue and efficacy of the divine mysteries. The woman, who had recovered the use of her reason and her senses, returned thanks publicly to God, and threw herself at the feet of the holy abbot, whom she regarded as her deliverer. The church resounded with acclamations. The faithful of every age and sex, expressed their admiration by cries of joys and hymns of gladness. The bells were rung. The Lord was blessed with one unanimous voice, and the whole city, transported with love for Saint Bernard, rendered him an honor, if we may be permitted to say it, beyond what was due to a mortal man. Chapter 3. More Miracles at Milan. The news of the events at Milan were soon spread abroad, and the reputation of the holy man was diffused through Italy. It was everywhere announced that a great prophet had arisen, powerful in works and words, who healed the sick and delivered the possessed by the power of Jesus Christ. But as the crowd which thronged around his doors from morning till night seriously inconvenienced and almost stifled him, he appeared from the window of his house, and from thence he raised his hands to bless the people. Many persons had come in from the neighboring towns and villages, and all, strangers no less than citizens, followed the man of God wherever he went, eager to see and hear him, and to witness his miracles. One day, when he was in a vast hall amidst a number of persons who crowded around him, a man of distinguished dress and appearance made strenuous efforts to approach him, but without success. At length, by alternately crawling on his hands and feet, and climbing on the shoulders of those who were before him, he succeeded in opening a way through the crowd, and falling at the knees of the man of God, he covered him with kisses. The venerable Renewal, who was standing by, and I have this fact from his lips, tried to put an end to this scene, knowing that such demonstrations were very painful to Bernard, but the man, who remained prostrate, turned to him and said in a loud voice, "Suffer me to contemplate and touch this servant of God, this truly apostolic man, for I say unto you, and I affirm it on the faith of a Christian, that I have seen this apostle in the midst of the apostles of Christ." Renald was struck with astonishment, and would have inquired further about this vision, but refrained out of respect for Saint Bernard's presence. It may be conceived what an effect was produced on the multitude by this incident. The saint, writes another chronicler, had no longer any repose, because all who were troubled found their rest in his labor and weariness. Those who left his presence met other visitors who came to see him, and there was an uninterrupted succession of persons who came to ask favors of him. He restored a number of persons to health. He cured some by giving them holy water to drink, others by his touch alone, and in the same city, in the presence of various witnesses, he obtained from the Father of Lights the power of restoring sight to the blind by making the sign of the cross upon them. Amongst the numerous persons who came from all quarters of Milan, a noble knight brought a little girl to the servant of God, who had such a horror of the daylight that, although she always kept her eyelids closed, she also held her hands over her eyes, fearing lest the smallest ray might strike on them, for the light penetrated even to her brain, and caused her to utter fearful cries. Bernard blessed the child, and making the sign of the cross upon her, he sent her away in a more tranquil state. But whilst they were carrying her home, she opened her eyes, and continued her journey on foot, without needing any assistance. Amidst the unwonted honors that were reaped upon him, this great man, who was an object of unexampled veneration, who commanded kings and people, and bore alone all the burden of his age, remained, as it were, dead and motionless on the moving scene to which he gave life, and never raised himself above the simplicity of his state, so that, if there were anything in him which was more admirable than his works, it was that profound humility with which he exercised the kind of omnipotence which God had conferred on him for the edification of the Church. He seemed completely indifferent to the glory, honor, and reverence which he received on all sides, deaf and insensible to the praises of the world. He was also continually subject to acute bodily sufferings. These pains were very dear to him, because they reminded him constantly of the common fate of all mortals, and he knew, by the experience of the great apostle, that virtue is made perfect in infirmity. Chapter 4. The Crusades and Saint Bernard. The formidable race of the Turks had established their empire over all the East, and from thence they threatened an invasion of the West. The nations of Europe, weakened by the dismemberment of their territories and their civil dissensions, trembled at the approach of the waves of this impetuous torrent. how could its onward progress be arrested otherwise than by the union of all the people of Christendom? But, like all great undertakings, such a concourse and general uniting of nations could only be effected under the influence of a religious idea. The divine breath of religion only possesses the power of inspiring all men with one common sentiment, uniting them in one thought, and kindling among them a universal flame of generous enthusiasm. The human mind at that period was, doubtless, unable to comprehend the sublime and vast ramifications of this great idea. Man is almost always the blind instrument of a work which surpasses his understanding. The seed that he has sown can only be revealed by its fruit. The Crusaders, in their warlike ardor, aimed only at the deliverance of the sepulchre, and they were the deliverers of the world. But it was fitting that the essential idea of the crusade should be displayed in all its simplicity, in order to be received and understood by the intellect of the age. The object in view was to rescue from the devil that sacred land, above which the heavens had opened to give testimony to the Son of God. This was clear to the capacity of all, and the magical influence of this divine idea captivated the whole of Christendom and revived its faith. The first result of this movement was a spirit of union among the nations, and a wonderful harmony of sentiments, thoughts, and interests, which unexpectedly put an end to all religious dissensions, political disturbances, and civil wars. In the next place, as a natural consequence, followed the exaltation of the papacy, which always resumed its place at the head of human affairs when the spirit of concord is to be revived among the nations. The Crusades alone gave to the Holy See more weight and influence in the affairs of the world than any doctrine, theory, or triumph by sword or word before or since, and this central influence and great preponderance which it possessed was the mainspring of the development of the Middle Ages and of the civilization of future times. It is certainly true that the soldiers of the cross were not always guided by the Spirit of God, or influenced by justice, charity, and truth. We do not pretend to deny the monstrous abuses which too often disgrace their enterprises. But, in this place, the only important point for consideration is the great idea which predominates over all these questions, and it is rather by this idea than by the fact which resulted therefrom that we must judge of the man whose fiery eloquence aroused the spirit of the Crusades. Eugenius III had the interests of the Eastern Church so much at heart, knowing the high endowments and supernatural gifts of Saint Bernard, and Bernard, full of zeal for the Church and deference towards its head, courageously accepted the weighty burden of this apostolic mission. Saint Bernard, after having given the cross to the King of France, felt himself entirely moved to go amongst the valiant Teutons, so renowned for their bravery, that he might enroll them in the service of Christ. Doubtless he foresaw that he would reap an abundant harvest, but he was not prepared for a success surpassing that which he obtained in France. His zeal allowed of no delay. He took no account of the severity of the season, nor the fatigues of the journey, nor of the continual infirmities. And about the end of autumn of the same year, 1146, a short time after the assembly at Chartres, he set out, accompanied by 2 monks of Clairvaux, Godfrey, his biographer, and Gerard. Here begins a long series of labors and miracles, which the companions of the holy monk registered day by day, and which are loudly attested by contemporary historians, which the 12th century, with one voice, has related for the admiration of posterity, and which even the most incredulous writers have been forced to admit, though they could not comprehend them. Godfrey, one of the secretaries of the illustrious abbot during his journey, comforted the community at Clairvaux by sending them a faithful account of the miracles wrought in Germany, and this writer, whose style is so admirable for its ingenuous simplicity, complains that his pen could not suffice to relate so many things. "The servant of God," he writes, "works more miracles easily than we can write them." From this person seem to flow all those virtues which once characterized the divine mission of the greatest apostles. His breath, his blessing, his touch, his prayer, his very presence wrought prodigies of wonder. The most inveterate maladies disappeared suddenly at the voice of the man of God. Whole populations, in a number of different towns, published with gratitude the miracles they had witnessed in every place on his journey, and wrought the most astonishing and instantaneous cures. The blind recovered their sight, to the deaf and dumb hearing and speech were restored, the paralytic received the use of their limbs, the possessed, the lunatic, and the demoniac were delivered from the spirits which tormented them. But the greatest of his miracles was the conversion of hardened hearts and the penances to which public sinners submitted. One day an immense crowd gathered in the church to see the face of the man of God. He had suddenly cured a paralytic old man, who was known throughout the town for his bountiful almsdeeds, and this miracle, as well as many other no less striking, have been proclaimed by the chimes of the bells and the admiring cries of the multitude. The concourse was so great that no power could restrain the crowds of the people, who rushed impetuously into the vast basilica. Saint Bernard, closely surrounded on all sides, would have been smothered by the crowd, had not the emperor, throwing off his mantle, raised him up in powerful arms and borne him away to a place of safety. In the same town, Count Adelphius, one of the nobles in the emperor's train, was desirous of trying in person the effect of the power of the abbot of Clairvaux. He brought to him a blind and lame child, whose cure seemed to him utterly impossible. Saint Bernard blessed him, and at the same moment the child recovered the use of his limbs, and his eyes were opened. We may conceive the sensation caused by these wonders, and the weight which they added to the mission of him who performed them. The people demanded the cross, but the princes, who were restrained by political considerations, wavered in a state of anxious perplexity. Saint Bernard, from that time, foresaw what would be the happy result of his labors. However, like the wise husbandman, he thought it would be well to quit for a time the field he had cultivated, and to leave the care of ripening the seeds of the world to the power of divine grace. Herman, Bishop of Constance, earnestly entreated him to edify his vast diocese by preaching the crusade. For a long time Bernard resisted, but at length, overcome by the constancy of the Lord of Constance, he embarked with him and sailed up the Rhine. They stopped at the towns and principal villages on the banks of the river, and reaped everywhere the most abundant fruits from the preaching of the cross. This voyage was kind of a triumphal march. A numerous train followed Saint Bernard. The company consisted of 11 venerable persons besides Bernard, and every evening they used to note down, in an itinerary journal, the glorious actions which they had witnessed. But they were unable to write down all. It would require volumes to recount all we have seen, says one of them, but if we were silent, the stones would cry out. Philip of Clairvaux sent to the Archbishop of Reims an extract from his journal, which has been preserved intact, and this curious document, together with many others of that time, will enable the reader to follow the apostolic journeys of Saint Bernard, step by step. Let us hear the traveller speak. Bishop Herman. The first day at Freiburg, there were only some poor, mean people who asked for the cross. The holy abbot made us pray that the eyes of the rich might also be opened, and hardly was this prayer ended when the richest, and even the most hardened, came to receive the cross from his own hand. Philip. Let us note down likewise the manner in which he restored sight to a blind old man. Virtue had gone out of our Holy Father, not from him, however, but from the word and the sign of life. Herman. This morning after Mass, I presented to him a girl who had a withered hand. He cured her on the spot. Philip. I saw him restore sight to a child deaf and dumb from his birth. Herman. I myself spoke to the child at the moment when the sign of the cross was made on him, and he heard and answered me distinctly. The abbot Frobenius. A mother brought to her little blind child, and the sign of the cross restored his sight. But what was the mother's surprise when the child stretched out his hand to an apple which was offered him? Eberhard. On leaving the church, an infirm and paralytic man who could only drag himself along recommended himself to the holy abbot. Hardly had the latter touched him with his stick in my presence than the man felt himself cured and went away, leaping for joy. These miracles, which are noted down simply and shortly, one after another, by ocular witnesses, would form too large a volume if we were to recount them all to you now. They were so numerous that the witnesses themselves were unable to detail them all. Bernard cured in one day 9 blind persons, 10 who were deaf and dumb, and 18 lame or paralytic. On the following Wednesday, the number of the miracles was still greater. At last, on Friday, the 13th of December, they arrived at Constance. The bells of the town announced the wonders which attended the footsteps of the man of God. The people, with 1,000 cries of Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, ran to meet him, giving glory to Jesus Christ. All praised God, and not one mouth was silent in the midst of these joyful manifestations. The preaching of the crusade seemed to have become a mere accessory in this universal agitation. He spoke, or rather, he showed himself, and at the mere sight of the apostle, at the first sound of his voice, the people burst into tears, and the minds of his hearers became humble and docile, and answered his appeal. Thus a long stay in each town was not only unnecessary, but even impossible, on account of the tumultuous concourse of people who flocked together, desirous to hear the saint's words, and still more anxious to see his miracles. At Constance, as at Frankfurt, he was nearly suffocated. His garments were torn off piecemeal to make crosses, which he found very inconvenient, and he was frequently obliged to accept new clothes. It was about this time that Saint Bernard converted a young knight who was rich in earthly goods, but poor in those of heaven, and full of vice and iniquity. His name was Henry. He had received a good education, and as he spoke French and German, he attached himself to the saint to serve as his interpreter. This remarkable conversion produced a no less remarkable miracle, which we must not pass over in silence. The noble Henry was riding alongside of Saint Bernard on the highway, when he was, all at once, followed by one of his former squires, who attacked him with jeers and insults. He was a man of Belial, a lover of perversity, and incredulous in all things. He blasphemed the servant of God, and cried out with all his might, "Go, follow the devil, and may the devil take you." While the travelers thus continued their journey in peace, the holy abbot was entreated to give his blessing to a crippled woman, whom they laid at his feet. This occurrence only served to increase the fury of the madman, but when he beheld the woman suddenly cured, he fell back as if struck by an unseen hand, and laid stretched on the earth without life or motion. His former master, horrified at his awful death, cast himself at Saint Bernard's feet, and implored him to take pity on his soul, which Satan had filled with his malediction. "It is on your account," he said. "It is because he blasphemed against you that this terrible judgment has befallen him." "God forbid," replied the saint, "that anyone should die on my account." Then, retracing his steps, he leaned over the corpse of the squire, and slowly recited the Lord's Prayer, his voice tremulous with emotion. "Hold him by the head," he said to the numerous stand-byers. Then, anointing him with his spittle, which he frequently used as if it were a medicinal remedy, he cried out, "In the name of the Lord, arise!" And he repeated, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, may God restore thee to life." These words, uttered in a solemn tone, amidst the mournful silence of the spectators, had hardly ceased, when the dead man arose and looked up to heaven. At the sight of this corpse, erect and restored to life, the people manifested their admiration and surprise by loud acclamations. The saint, meanwhile, addressed him as follows. "Now," he said, "what are thy dispositions? What art thou about to do?" "My father, I will do all you command," replied the squire, who was completely changed. He took the cross, and enrolled himself in the ranks of the crusaders. One of those present asked him if he had been really dead. "I was dead," he answered, "and I heard the sentence of my condemnation. For if the holy abbot had not interposed, I should now be in hell." Henry, who was more deeply struck than the rest by this extraordinary event, retired to Clairvaux, where he made his profession, and he was oftentimes wont to relate to his assembled brethren the grace which he had received, and the wonderful prodigy which he had witnessed. Miracles in Christmastide. Shortly after, Saint Bernard left Constance with the same companions who had attended him thither, except Bishop Herman, who gave his place to a holy priest named Wolkamar. They passed through Zurich, Rufendell, Basel, Winterthur, and arrived at Strasbourg on the eve of the fourth Sunday of Advent, the 22nd of December, 1146. The miracle ceased not during this memorable journey, and, to use the expression of one of his biographers, we should fear not to say enough if we only mentioned some of his miracles, and to tell less that the truth if we related a great many. When he was preaching at Strasbourg and to the other German cities, it is a wonderful fact that, though he only spoke in Latin or in the Frank language, he was understood by all, and his words moved even those who knew no other tongue than German. The monk Godfrey says that these persons heard him with so much the more affection, as they were moved and touched by the very power of his words far more than by the interpretation of a learned man who explained his discourses. They proved this by the compunction with which they struck their breasts and shed tears. Meanwhile, the day of our Lord's Nativity drew near, and the Emperor had chosen that festival to hold a general diet in the city of Spires. Saint Bernard had promised to be present at the assembly. He left Strasbourg the evening of Sunday, December 22nd, and arrived at Spires on the following Tuesday, being the vigil of Christmas. The inhabitants of the different towns and villages stood on the banks of the river, waiting with impatience for the vessel to pass by, that they might receive the blessing of the man of God and lay the sick at his feet. All had their share in the wonderful grace which God attached to every word and action of his servant. His entrance into the imperial city of Spires has been described by a number of contemporary chroniclers. Quote, "The bishop, the clergy, and the citizens come to meet him with great solemnity, with crosses and banners, and the members of the various guilds carrying the badges of their profession. He was conducted through the city amid the sounds of bells and sacred hymns, to the door of the cathedral, where the Emperor of the German princes received him with all the honor due to the Pope's envoy. There was an immense crowd of people, some of whom had come from a great distance to see and hear the saint, and to behold the countenance of the wonder-worker. The procession advanced from the great door of the cathedral to the choir, chanting joyfully the hymn to the Queen of Heaven, Salve Regina. Saint Bernard, conducted by the Emperor himself, walked in the middle of the procession, surrounded by the crowds of people, and deeply moved on beholding the interior of the majestic basilica. But when the last accents of the hymn to the Virgin Mary had died away through the sacred aisles, after these words, Filium tuum nobis post hoc exilium ostende, the holy abbot, transported by his enthusiasm, added a threefold aspiration, O clemens, O pia, O dulcis Virgo Maria. These sweet and tender words, which flowed spontaneously from Saint Bernard's heart, were thenceforth added to the hymn, Salve Regina, and completed its sublime poetry. They are still sung in all Catholic churches at the appointed seasons, but in the Cathedral of Spires the Salve Regina is solemnly chanted every day in the year in honor of Saint Bernard, and this custom still exists today. Plates of brass were laid down in the pavement of the church to mark the footsteps of the man of God to posterity, and the places where he so touchingly implored the clemency, the mercy, and the sweetness of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The miracles were less numerous in Spires because, said one of the companions of his journey, the multitude of the curious was too great, and the glory of God does not manifest itself in favor of curiosity. The assembly at the Diet was very large. The great number of the bishops and princes met together to discuss the affairs of the empire, and in the august assembly, the ceremony of the emperor's coronation increased the splendor of the religious solemnity. But Saint Bernard was deeply concerned at the dispositions of these great personages. Their irreconcilable animosities rendered them deaf to any overtures of peace, and the servant of God vainly endeavored to allay their mutual grievances, and to make their personal interests give way to the cause of the Holy Sepulchre. But neither the miracles by which he proved that his mission was divine, nor the ardent and apostolic remarks which he addressed to the prince and to the monarch himself could overcome their lack of will. King Conrad, however, appeared to be more moved than the rest, and 2 days after Christmas, on the feast of Saint John the Evangelist, after he had been urgently pressed by the abbot of Clairvaux, he announced that he would deliberate on the matter in his council, and that, on the following day, he would give a definite reply. This was a critical moment. An incalculable number of events depended on the emperor's resolution. Bernard, however, did not wait until the next day. He was celebrating the holy sacrifice in the presence of the court and a great number of the faithful, when, yielding to one of those inspirations which had so often produced great effects, he turned towards the people and pronounced an impassioned discourse on the woes of the Holy Land. In the midst of his oration, he addressed himself directly to the emperor, who spoke to him, not as to a sovereign, but as a simple individual. He reminded him of the gifts he had received, and of the graces which had been vouchsafed to him. He reproached him with his ingratitude, and full of divine inspiration, he cried out in a voice of thunder, "O man, what wilt thou answer in the day of judgment?" Conrad, struck with terror, and pierced, as it were, even to the marrow of his bones, interrupted the preacher and demanded the cross of Christ. "I acknowledge," he said with tears, "that God has given me many graces, and with the help of the Lord I will not render myself unworthy to them." And he added, "I am ready to devote my life to the Lord, and to go wherewithsoever he calls me." The people, deeply moved and astonished at this extraordinary scene, raised their hands to heaven and filled the basilica with prolonged acclamations. The whole city was in a state of excitement and commotion, and the earth re-echoed, afar off, the people's cries of joy and enthusiasm. Meanwhile, the humble Saint Bernard remained profoundly recollected after this miracle of miracles, and taking the sacred banner from the altar, he placed it in the emperor's hands, and adorned him with the glorious symbol of the God of hosts. At the same moment, all the princes, with one simultaneous impulse, knelt at the feet of the holy preacher, and asked for the pilgrim's cross. Foremost amongst them was the young Frederick, the emperor's nephew, and the heir to the throne, afterwards so famous under the title of Barbarossa. He took the cross in spite of the tears and entreaties of his aged father. The barons and knights eagerly followed the example of their lords, and not only the grandees, but the people were desirous to receive the cross from Saint Bernard's hands. No obstacle, no consideration could resist this unanimous impulse. The great interest of the crusade had absorbed all other interests and feelings. Men differing in age, rank, education, and descent united together in the same cause, and enrolled themselves under the same standard, and the Diet, which had been convoked to remedy the wrongs of Germany, was now only occupied in discussing the fate of Jerusalem. This sudden change was looked upon by all as the miracle of miracles. Hope revived in every heart, and all, forgetting their past dissensions, roused themselves from their lethargy to begin a new life and taste the consolations of religion. "Wonderful to tell," says a contemporary chronicler, "robbers and brigands came together from all parts to do penance, and vowed that they would shed their blood for Christ." Every reasonable man, adds the historian, who witnessed the changes wrought in them, beheld the finger of God, and was not the less astonished. Oh, who shall work such a desired revolution at the present time? Who shall reveal unto us the idea, the sentiment, which can break the bonds of egotism, enlarging the mind and kindling in the heart of man the fire of a living and life-giving faith? More miracles on Saint Bernard's journey. Saint Bernard spent the remainder of this memorable years at Spires and did not resume his journey till the 4th of January 1141. At his departure, the emperor, the princes, and the numerous battalions of crusaders crowded around him to hear his words for the last time, and to pay him their last homage. The sacred order addressed to them a touching exhortation. And his words, says the historian, are not human, but divine. The brilliant train set forth, advancing with difficulty on account of the immense crowd which poured through the streets and along the road. Suddenly a poor crippled child threw himself before the saint and asked for his blessing. At the same moment this child arose, perfectly cured. At the sight of this miracle, the emperor, who was riding at the side of the saint, and the whole astonished crowd, sent forth their acclamations of surprise, blessing the wonder-working saint. But he, drawing back from all this homage, turned towards Conrad and said to him, "It is on your account that this cure has been worked, that you may know that God is with you, and that your undertaking is pleasing to him." In all the cities through which the servant of God passed, he renewed his preaching and his miracles, but the edification he gave was nowhere greater than at Cologne. He knew the impatience of this city to receive him, and in order to escape the honors which they were preparing for him, he made his entrance secretly in the evening. But glory pursued him who fled from it, and the news of his arrival had hardly spread through the city when the inhabitants flocked in crowds to his dwelling, and testified their tumultuous rejoicing throughout the whole night. The crowd was so close and so intolerable, says one of his disciples, that the holy abbot could not go out of his house. He remained at a window, from which he blessed the people, and it was only by means of a ladder placed in the street that they were able to present to his notice the sick, whom he restored to health. They dared not open the doors on account of the multitude which besieged the entrance. As to myself, says the monk Gerard, being desirous of entering the house, I could not do so in any way, and from 9 in the morning till the evening I remained in the street, without being able to reach either the door or the ladder, so completely was the avenue stopped up. The writer abandons the attempt to enumerate the number of miracles which took place at Cologne during the 4 days, from the 9th to the 12th of January. They remained in the city. On the Sunday, Saint Bernard celebrated Mass in the cathedral to satisfy the wishes of all. He preached in the marketplace, where his discourses electrified the multitude. Wonderful cures distinguished this day. A woman had lost her reason through the bitter grief she had felt at the death of her husband, was brought to him, and regained on touching the holy man of God her senses and her power of mind. Another woman, subject to nervous convulsions, received her health at the moment he blessed her with the holy sign of the cross. A woman of quality who, from the age of 15, had been deprived of the use of an eye, had lost all hope of recovery after having vainly tried every kind of remedy, she recommended herself to the servant of God, and regained her sight. 14 other cures are named in the journal as having taken place in the same day, and these miracles, says one of the secretaries, were not done in the dark, but in full day, in public, before the whole world, that all the world might glorify God, who is wonderful in his saints. But these sudden cures were but the smallest portion of the wonders which the servant of God performed in a less visible manner. He displayed, indeed, all the plenitude of the power which Jesus Christ gave to his apostles of casting out evil spirits, and healing every sickness and infirmity. But his miracles, like those of the apostles, as also those of Jesus Christ himself, always contained something symbolical, and were but the visible signs of another species of miracle, of an operation more interior, more mysterious, which was accomplished in the soul. The conversion of hearts, the triumph of light over darkness, of peace over vengeance, of justice over iniquity, of Christian piety over stupid indifference, such were the great effects arising from his instructions. The inveterate evils which had for a long time destroyed public morals had produced a blindness, a deafness, a fatal paralysis far more fatal than any physical evil, and it was to these deep wounds that he applied all the unction of his words. Hence arose the disposition which characterized a great number of the Crusaders. The lively and vehement reaction which they manifested in favor of the holy war arose from the deep want ever experienced by the spirit of penance. for true penitence always feels itself irresistibly drawn towards some work of expiation. This warlike enterprise, so suited to the temper of the multitude and to the popular impetuosity, could not have the same attraction for certain tender souls which, having returned to God, felt themselves drawn to an interior life, and yearned for more peaceful labors. For a life of recollection and of prayer, these souls attached themselves more closely to Saint Bernard, and in the neighborhood of Cologne alone there were, without reckoning women, nearly 60 who abandoned the world, most of whom retired to Clairvaux. The abbot of Clairvaux, accompanied by an always increasing number of his disciples, went from Cologne to Juliers, where he celebrated the holy mysteries in the chapel of Charlemagne. Ox, says the chaplain Eberhard, with great naivete, is an agreeable abode, but more so for the senses than for the soul. The prosperity of the merchants is their death, and woe to the undisciplined house. I say not this for their ruin, but for their amendment. If at any time some of them should read these words, and, would to God, that but one among them might be converted and live. The same narrator relates the following fact, which happened at La Chapelle. We were at the altar of the Blessed Virgin, and I attended upon the Reverend Father, when a young girl was presented to him. He blessed her, and she was healed. But the crowd was so great that we were obliged to retire. We will quote a few more instances from the Journal of the Travelers. Gerard. Today the miracles seem to have been redoubled. The crowd follows us everywhere, and the fields are as full as the towns. A mother brought a great girl who had been deaf and dumb from her birth. The charitable father imposed his hands on her, and instantly, in our presence, she obtained both hearing and speech. We had scarcely proceeded a few steps when a man, quite as deaf, was suddenly healed. Godfrey. Until the occurrence of this miracle, I was before him and preceded the crowd, but struck with the exclamations which every moment resounded behind me, I made careful inquiries concerning all which had happened, and I ascertained the fact that, on this one day, our Holy Father healed, on the road, 1 blind girl, 3 deaf persons, 1 cripple, and after that, 5 blind men. Abbot Campigbus. When we arrived in the evening at Juliers, a city which owed its origin to Julius Caesar, we found a crippled woman prostrate on the steps of the church. The saint, moved with compassion, took her by the hand and raised her, with so much the more ease on account of her great faith. Gerard. This morning, after the celebration of Mass, a woman of considerable importance, the niece of the Count of Juliers, was entirely deprived of the use of one eye, and could see very little with the other, so that she could not walk without a guide, was instantly healed by the simple sign of the cross. This miracle, like the others, was the subject of public rejoicing, and the people incessantly cried out, Christe un gaude, Christe eleison, during the whole route at Maastricht, at Liège, at Mons, at Yalchiens, at Cambrai, at Vaucelles. Innumerable miracles gave token of the passing of the man of God. On leaving Liège, a young man, blind from his birth, was presented to him. His eyes were not only sightless, says 2 of the chroniclers, but they were dried up, and the lids were closed shut. The saint opened them, touched them with his venerable fingers, and immediately restored their sight. The happy young man, at seeing the light which he had never known, felt an extraordinary emotion. I see, cried he, I see light, I see men, and I see creatures with hair. Then he clapped his hands and, jumping for joy, exclaimed, O my God, now I shall never again hurt my feet against the stones. But Bernard, notwithstanding the desires which continually urged him to go back to his cloister, thought that he ought to stay some days in Flanders, where he knew, like St. Paul at Ephesus, that a great door was open to him. The words which he addressed to the population of this province had not the crusade alone for their object. They were principally directed to morals and doctrine, which the new heretics took pains to pervert. The man of God erected a wall against the enemies of the Church, and casting his net into the stream of the age, he drew forth an abundant draught of men, of letters, and noble personages. Amongst the latter, the annalist of Clairvaux relates a conversion, the edifying circumstances of which claim a place here. Arnulf of Morocca was one of the most wealthy and highly esteemed nobles of his province. He was living in pleasure and magnificence, when on Saint Bernard's journey he listened to a sermon which caused the veil to fall from his eyes. Touched with grace, and penetrated even to the depths of his soul, he resolved immediately, in imitation of the apostles, to quit his house, his relatives, his country, and to follow Jesus Christ. But his family was numerous. His sons and his brothers, his fortune and the honor of his house claimed his presence. He thought it best, therefore, to conceal his design until a favorable time, and not to confide to anyone, not even to Saint Bernard, the secret of his conscience. Time rolled on, and Arnulf, instead of disengaging himself from worldly ties, engaged himself still more deeply in them, until one day he saw a poor shepherd arrive at his door, who threw himself at his feet, saying to him, "My lord, I pray you, by the love of Jesus Christ, to take me to Clairvaux to save my soul and yours." The noble Arnulf, struck by this mysterious event, could no longer resist the voice which urged him, and, arranging his affairs, he set off for Clairvaux with the shepherd whom God had sent to him. He there found the saint, and revealed to him, with an effusion of tears, the iniquities of a long life. But to his great surprise, the man of God, after having exhorted him to persevere in the order of Citeaux, only imposed on him as a penance a triple recital of the Lord's Prayer. "What, O most charitable Father," exclaimed the penitent, "do you not take seriously the conversion of so unworthy a sinner? Assuredly 10 years of fasting and mortification would not suffice for expiation of my crimes, and you only give me 3 potters?" The saint replied, "Do you think you know better than I do what is needful for you?" "God forbid that I should be so presumptuous," replied Arnulf, "but I entreat you not to spare me in this world, that I may find my happiness in the future life." "Do as I bid you," replied the father, "and do it with confidence, and when you shall have laid down the burden of the flesh, you shall ascend to God without any other." The tone of inspiration and authority with which he spoke calmed the conscience of Arnulf, and gained him profound peace. But soon after, this soldier of God fell sick of an inflammation in the bowels, and the illness made such rapid progress that the holy oils were administered to him. Amidst his great sufferings, and when the sick man seemed ready to die, he was heard to cry out suddenly, "Lord Jesus, yes, all thy words are true." He repeated these words so often that one of his assistants attributed to delirium. "No, no," cried the dying man. "What I feel is not delirium, but I attest with my whole heart that every word of the Lord Jesus is infallibly accomplished. He has promised in his Gospels to those who renounce all things to follow him 100-fold in this world, and eternal life in the world to come. Well, I feel at this moment the truth of these words. The spiritual consolations which I experience surpass 100-fold all the joys of the world which I have felt." After saying these words, he fell asleep, sweetly and peacefully in the Lord. Thus were the words of the holy abbot accomplished. When you shall have laid down the burdens of the flesh, you shall depart to God without any other. Chapter 7. The Failure of the Second Crusade. The expedition, which was confirmed by signs and miracles, came to a disastrous end, and the Christian soldiers perished, defeated by the infidels, by the just judgment of God, and Saint Bernard, whom before all men was honored exceedingly, was condemned as an impostor and a false prophet. On that very day when the news came of the destruction of the Christian army, God wrought a miracle at the intercession of Saint Bernard. It came to pass, however, that when the lamentable tidings of the destruction of the Crusaders resounded through France, a father brought his blind boy to the servant of God, to have his sight restored to him, and, by many prayers, prevailed on the saint who declined. The saint, placing his hand on the child, prayed to our Lord that he would be pleased to make known, by restoring sight to the child, whether the preaching of the crusade was from him, and whether his spirit was with himself. While, after praying, he was waiting its effect, the child said, "What am I to do? For I see." Then a great shout was raised by those who were present, for many were present, not of the monks only, but of people living in the world, who, when they perceived that the boy saw, were greatly comforted, and gave thanks to God. Saint Bernard thus writes on the subject: "If one of two things must take place, then I prefer that men should murmur against us, and not against God. It is good for me that he is pleased to use me as a shield. I am ready to receive all the biting reproaches of my accusers. We said peace, and there was no peace. We promised good things, but behold confusion." He then says in his own defense, "As if we acted with rashness or levity in the matter, we went forward openly in it, not as if it were a doubtful matter, at thy bidding, namely Eugenius the Pope, or rather at the bidding of God through thee." Then stating the reproaches of the people, "Whence can we know that the word has gone forth from our Lord? What miracles dost thou do that we may believe in thee?" He answers as follows, addressing Eugenius, "It is not for me to reply to this. Spare me. Answer thou for me, and for thyself according to what thou hast seen and heard." In these words he modestly admits that he wrought miracles in confirmation of his preaching. No question could or can be raised as to the truth of the revelation and prophecy, but the most high and unchangeable truth of God was not understood by man. The counsel of men was one thing, that of God another. Men had proposed to themselves as their object the subjugation of Jerusalem, for their thoughts are of the earth, glory and wealth, and God, the eternal salvation of those who, in that expedition, had died for the faith and the Church. John, the venerable abbot of Casamare, made the matter known to Saint Bernard in a letter, in which he writes thus: "I have been informed, my most dear brother, that thou art greatly grieved at this affair I speak of, the expedition to Jerusalem, that it has not proposed according to thy wish, and that the Church and the glory of God have not increased as thou desirest." Then saying that the matter succeeded not according to the wishes of men, but the counsel of God, he thus proceeds: "But do not doubt what I am going to say. I make it known as to my spiritual father in confession. The patrons of this place of ours, the blessed John and Paul, have frequently visited us, and I have questioned them on this subject. They replied and said that a multitude of angels who have fallen have been restored in the person of those who fell there." Chapter 8. Saint Bernard combats heretics with the hand of God. The progress of error had already been repressed at its source by the glories of the Holy War, and heresy appeared to have lost the sort of charm which it had exercised over the lovers of novelty, from the moment that nobler interests had taken possession of the public sympathy. But if the tree of knowledge of evil no longer exhibited its proud summit in the light of day, its roots stretched all the deeper into the darkness of the earth, and its seeds, dispersed by the winds, were preparing to bring forth at some future time the fruits of bitterness and death. The Pope, according to the ancient tradition of Rome, was in no hurry either to condemn or to punish. He desired to penetrate to the bottom of things, and for this purpose he waited till the noise of arms should have ceased in the west, that he might examine, amid the peaceful and universal silence, the doctrine of the innovators. He settled himself for a time at Paris, where Saint Bernard, on his return from Treves, was not long before he joined him. A case which could not so well endure delay pressed very much upon the holy abbot of Clairvaux. It was the terrible ravages which the apostate Henry de Bruce had caused in the southern provinces of France. We have given an account in another place of the doctrine of this heresiarch, and the disturbances occasioned by him both in churches and individual souls. Eugenius judged it fitting to send into these provinces the Cardinal Albini, Bishop of Ostia, accompanied by the learned Godfrey, Bishop of Chartres, and Saint Bernard himself. The latter had first dispatched a letter to Hedilifionis, the governor of Narbonensian Gaul. He blamed him for having tolerated the preaching of the monk Henry, and set before him most energetically all the evils which it had caused. "The infection which this man has spread through your states," said he, in conclusion, "is felt throughout the whole world. This is the cause of the journey which we are about to undertake, come not amongst you from my own accord. Duty calls me, charity draws me. Perhaps it may be granted to me to pluck up out of the church this poisonous plant with its multiplied offshoots. It is true, mine is but a feeble arm for such a work, but I reckon upon the help of the holy bishops with whom I come, and on the powerful aid which I expect from you. At the head of the prelates to whom the Holy See has confided the care of this important affair is to be seen the illustrious Cardinal Bishop of Ostia, celebrated in Israel for the victories which he obtained over the enemies of God. It belongs to you to give an honorable reception to this Prince of the Church, and to second according to the power which God has given you, a mission which has no other object but your salvation and that of your subjects." End quote. Notwithstanding this recommendation, and perhaps against the goodwill of the Count Hedilifionis, the legate was disrespectfully received in the city of Albi. The great majority of the inhabitants of this unhappy city had rejected, together with the dogma of the supremacy of the Pope, the greater part of the teaching of the Church, and not only did they refuse to assist at the holy sacrifice which the cardinal celebrated in their cathedral, but they evinced by cries and sounds of discordant music the displeasure which his visit caused them, and the hatred they bore to the Holy See. "These people," writes Godfrey, "welcomed him with the braying of asses and the sounds of drums. They were scarcely 30 of the faithful at his mass." Saint Bernard arrived in the same city 2 days after the cardinal. In the morning he caused the bell to ring for mass, says the chronicler, and whether from curiosity to behold the most celebrated man of his day, or from the extraordinary blessing which followed wherever he went, the Albigensians flocked in such great numbers to the church that the vast nave could scarcely contain them. The servant of God, after the celebration of the holy mysteries, mounted the pulpit to preach the gospel to the multitude of erring men, who were all impatient to hear him. He spoke to them with the greatest gentleness, and explained to them article by article the different points of Catholic doctrine which the innovators had rejected or corrupted. Not satisfied with the rectifying of their doctrinal errors and the enlightening of their minds, he applied himself especially to the task of gaining their hearts, according to the recommendation of the prophet, "Speak to the heart of Jerusalem." And this method was the more easy to him, because his gracious words poured forth from an inexhaustible fountain of love, a power at once sweet and penetrating, a balsam of life, insinuated itself in the depths of their rebellious hearts, and softened their minds, like a shower which reanimates a field of corn, and sinks into the dried stems, recalling sap in life. The people who heard him showed by their tears the feeling which he had kindled within them, and the discourse was scarcely finished when truth triumphed. "Enter then into yourselves," says the holy preacher. "Return, erring children, into the unity of the Church, and that we may know who are those who have received the word of salvation, let them raise the right hand to heaven in token of their adhesion to the Catholic faith." At that moment all raised their right hand, and testified by a shout of joy their return to the bosom of the Church. The monk Godfrey, who regarded this touching scene as one of the most marvelous effects of the words of the man of God, described several of the other miracles wrought at Bergerac, at Calais, at Vitry-Fouillé, at Toulouse, and at other places. The most remarkable fact is that which happened at the town of Sarlat in Périgord. In this place, says the chronicler, after having preached to the obstinate heretics, they presented loaves to him to bless, as he was in the habit of doing elsewhere. When he had done this, he pronounced the following words: "You will acknowledge that we announce the truth to you, and that the innovators have seduced you from it, if your sick people recover this health by eating this bread." At these words, as he thought too positively spoken, the pious Godfrey, Bishop of Chartres, became alarmed and added, which means they shall be cured if they eat with a lively faith. No, replied the saint, in a tone which bespoke perfect confidence. I say that all who shall eat of this bread shall be healed of their sickness, that they may recognize by this token that our words are according to God and His truth. The miraculous bread produced numberless cures, and this miracle so forcibly struck the population of the neighboring towns that Bernard was obliged to change his route to escape from the intolerable honors of which he was the object. At Toulouse the effects of these words were not less abundant, but the excitement and the demonstrations of respect which were showered upon him by the inhabitants of this town nearly brought a serious illness upon Saint Bernard. It is said that his hands were many times so covered with kisses that they swelled considerably, as did also his thin and delicate arms, to such an extent that he could no longer give the benediction. But his infirmities did not lessen his zeal, and like a victim ever ready for the sacrifice, he labored for the salvation of his brethren at the expense of his own life. It is this profound abnegation which so fitted him in the hands of God for great things. "What dost thou expect from me, my Lord and my God?" said he one day. "These people seek for miracles, and we shall derive small profit from our words if thou dost not confirm them by regular tokens of thy power." He pronounced these words as he left the house of the Canons Regular of Toulouse, where an ecclesiastic named Bernard was ill, having been struck with palsy. But the man of God had hardly passed the threshold of the door when the dying man sprang from his bed and ran after Saint Bernard to thank him, with an effusion of gratitude, for his sudden and perfect recovery. And so we too, in this age of faithlessness, should run to Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, not only to find a person worthy of imitation or of sound doctrine, but as a powerful heavenly intercessor who can obtain many graces before the throne of God. Saint Bernard, who passing like an apostle through all the kingdoms of the West, carried to all peace and joy, working great wonders, deciding the most difficult questions, concluding the most complicated affairs, assisting at councils, confuting errors, converting the most hardened sinners, obtain for us of the Lord the grace that by our lives we may shed the odor of Jesus around, and have, like you, a lively faith that can move mountains, and an ardent love for the most holy Eucharist, the greatest and most precious treasure of Christianity. Amen. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, pray for us.